Well, hello, everybody. I want to welcome you to our webinar today. My name is Danny DeArmas, and I'm a member of the Central Florida Commission on Religious Freedom. I'm also one of the pastors at First Baptist Church of Orlando. I'm honored to have been chosen by our little commission on religious freedom to be our moderator for today's event. And we're really grateful to all of you who are joining us today. We're live on Zoom and we're live streaming on YouTube. And we're also recording the event. So whether you're watching us live right now or you happen to be watching us later on, I still want to tell you a couple things about the commission before we get started. Our commission is a local religious freedom commission made up of members of a wide variety of faith and thought traditions. And the mission of the Central Florida Commission on Religious Freedom is to increase awareness and facilitate respectful, thoughtful, candid conversation between people of diverse beliefs concerning the nature, role, and importance of religious freedom in our community, state, nation, and world. And that's definitely the goal on today's webinar. And we have a great panel for you today. I know our panelists will help us better understand the issues that we're talking about today and help us see them and hopefully maybe even reconsider them in some way or another, since it's through understanding that we can better advance religious freedom for ourselves and others. And by the way, if you want to find out more about our in-person or online events that we have in the future, including our annual Summit on Religious Freedom, which is held each January or February, you can sign up for our emails at a link that David Williamson is putting in the chat. And that link will give you a way that you can sign up to be on our email list. We really would welcome you and appreciate you being a part of that with us if you want to do so. If you're on the Zoom webinar, that chat option is at the bottom of your screen on your computer. If you're on a mobile device, just tap the screen and it should appear as an option. And chat is where you get the link, but it's not where you ask questions. If you want to ask a question, we want to ask you to use the Q&A feature, which is also at the bottom of your screen. And we'll take those questions as we're able at the end. We're going to hear from both of our panelists today, and then we'll have a time for Q&A. Not sure we'll get to all the questions, but feel free, please, to be populating the questions as you have them during the presentations from our two panelists. Today, we're thrilled to have with us, first off, Andrew Seidel. Andrew is a constitutional and civil rights attorney and author at the Freedom from Religion Foundation. Anthony works to ensure that the government obeys our First Amendment and that the wall of separation between state and church remains tall and impregnable. You might be interested to know that before dedicating his life and law degree to helping atheists assert their rights in keeping state and church separate, Andrew was a Grand Canyon tour guide and an accomplished nature photographer. We welcome you, Andrew, to our time today.
Thank you so much.
Joining us also is Mike Batts, who is an author and the managing partner of the accounting firm Batts, Morrison, Wales, and Lee. Mike served as the chairman for the Commission on Accountability and Policy for Religious Organizations, which was a national non-governmental commission that made recommendations to various government entities and the nonprofit sector concerning federal tax policy affecting religious and other nonprofit organizations. You might be interested to know about Mike, that although it was years apart, Mike and I both had JJ Masters for accounting at Stetson University. And Mike graduated summa cum laude and went on to score the highest score in the state of Florida on the CPA exam. I dropped out of accounting and became a pastor. And we welcome you as well, Mike.
Thank you, Danny.
So the topic today that we want to talk about is the Johnson Amendment. And let me talk to you about the structure that we'll have for our time together today. We're going to give each of our panelists a few minutes to provide an opening statement, and then we conducted a coin toss ahead of time, and Andrew will go first. And then after their opening statements, they'll each get a time for response. After their openings and responses, each of them having time for both of those, will then have a time for questions from you and from all of us. So that's the way we will go. And Andrew will go first. But before he does that, for those of you who are not sure what the Johnson Amendment is, the Johnson Amendment is a provision in the U.S. tax code that was adopted in 1954. And it's the amendment that prohibits all 501c3 nonprofit organizations, including churches and other houses of worship, from endorsing or opposing political candidates. And our commission felt like that at this season, in this election year, maybe there's been no better time for us to have a discussion around this topic and to gain a better understanding of it for all of us. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Andrew and to let you take it away, Andrew.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for hosting this. Thank you, Mike, for joining. I'm going to start my timer here. Charitable donations should go to charitable works. That is the Johnson Amendment. For all that you are going to hear today, it is that simple. Charitable giving should fund charitable work, not political campaigns. And there is a small vocal faction that if you listen to, they're trying to repeal this common sense rule. They will tell you that it's about free speech and religious freedom. It's not. Like so many things, it's about money and power. The Johnson Amendment is a simple rule. Nonprofits, including churches, are eligible for a valuable government privilege, tax exemption. And tax exemption is a privilege. It is not a right. And the government can attach strings to that privilege. One of the strings is the Johnson Amendment. It prevents 501c3 charities from endorsing or opposing political candidates. And again, that's because we want charitable donations to go to charitable works, not political campaigns. That's it. That's all. Don't take a stance on partisan political campaigns. Churches are fully permitted to talk about issues and engage in nonpartisan lobbying, such as on gay marriage or abortion or civil rights. For instance, I can tell you as a representative of my nonprofit that Amy Coney Barrett is a threat to our healthcare, our democracy, reproductive justice, equal marriage, birth control, our ability to beat the climate crisis, and much more. And that you should call your senators and tell them to oppose her nomination. We can engage on issues. The rule was passed in 1954 and it didn't stop, and it was never intended to stop Martin Luther King Jr. from preaching civil rights from the pulpit, for instance. And it didn't stop many of the conservative white churches in the South from opposing King and the civil rights movement. The Johnson Amendment simply means that tax-exempt groups may not abuse their tax-exempt privilege by endorsing a candidate or engaging in partisan politicking. And the common sense rule applies to all charities and 501c3 nonprofits. It doesn't single out or pick on churches. And this is a crucial thing. The rule only stops nonprofits and their representatives, or churches and pastors, from doing this in their official capacity. They're still free to tell their friends and family what they think and tell people on their social media platforms, their personal social media platforms, who to vote for. They just can't do it from the pulpit or on an official church letterhead. I talk about politics relentlessly on my personal Twitter feed, but never when I represent FFRF. And remember, if a church or a nonprofit really does want to endorse a political candidate, it still can. Nothing is stopping it. They absolutely have that freedom. It just has to pay taxes like everybody else who has that freedom. But that's not good enough for this small vocal fringe. They want to have their cake and eat it too. It is important to know that the United States Court of Appeals for the DC Circuit, which is sometimes called the second highest court in the land, held that this rule, the electioneering ban, is constitutional and not a violation of a church's free speech or free exercise or other rights, including rights under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act in the case Branch Ministries versus Rosati. So no, the rule is not a ban or even a burden on free speech or religious exercise. It's just a refusal to give special treatment to this small vocal faction. And it is a small vocal faction. The rule is very popular. So popular that Trump's repeated promise to totally destroy the Johnson Amendment has come to nothing. He failed repeatedly. My organization, the Freedom from Religion Foundation, successfully sued him, and his Department of Justice admitted in court that he failed. He can't get it done. He couldn't get it done because so many people defended the rule. Poll after poll shows that the vast majority of Americans want to keep politics out of their pulpits and their charities. According to Lifeway Research, which is an evangelical polling group, their slogan is biblical solutions for life. Biblical solutions for life. They found that nearly 80% of Americans oppose pastors endorsing a candidate in church, and 75% oppose churches publicly endorsing candidates. And it's not just the congregants in the pews that want this rule. Religious leaders want this rule too. More than 4,000 faith leaders from diverse backgrounds asked Congress to protect this rule. They represented the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the American Jewish Committee, the Episcopal Church, Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the Franciscan Action Network, the Hindu American Foundation, the Interfaith Alliance, United Methodist, United Church of Christ, United Unitarian Universalist Association. Another letter headed up by the African American Ministers in Action supporting the Johnson Amendment drew 100 major religious denominations and organizations, including the National Baptist Convention of America, the National Council of Churches, the Anti-Defamation League, the Seventh-day Adventist Church of North America, and more from virtually every tradition. Nonprofits want this rule. Almost 6,000 nonprofits wrote Congress supporting this rule. Huge list, including Habitat for Humanity, Goodwill, the Girl Scouts, the Baptist Joint Committee, the YWCA, the Ford Foundation, and virtually every one of the other NPR supporting foundations that you hear if you listen to NPR. The American Heart Association, Feeding America, Feed the Children, Guide Star, the National 4-H Council, and the National Council of Nonprofits. So Americans, nonprofits, and most churches and houses of worship want to keep the Johnson Amendment just as it is. The push to repeal it is not about freedom. It's about money and power. And unlike other 501c3s, churches don't file any or report any financial information to the IRS. Every other charity in the country has to file a Form 990 or financial disclosures with the IRS of some kind. They track essentially every penny that comes in and every penny that goes out, but not churches. They are financial black holes. So without the Johnson Amendment, any mega donor could write a check to the nearest church for any amount, earmark that donation for politicking, and then take a tax write-off for it. Meanwhile, the church can then turn around and spend that donation on anything, including political campaigns. Churches would become super PACs, unregulated, unaccountable, opaque super PACs. I mean, we might even see PACs reorganizing as churches to compete for donors who will give their donation, now tax deductible, to these churches. And I mean, that is an untenable situation that will definitely lead to the government regulation of churches. So gutting this popular common sense rule will be far worse for our democracy and society than the Citizens United decision. And it will gift this fringe faction with a scary amount of political power. And remember, that is the goal. Instead, I propose that we all agree that ensuring charitable donations go to charitable works is a rule that is worthy of our esteem and protection. And I will leave it there with 15 seconds to spare.
Thank you, Andrew. Excellent. And Mike, I welcome you as well, and take it away. Wait, I need to unmute you. Now
Thank
go
you
ahead.
very much, Danny, and great to be with you and Andrew as well. Yes, I'd like to talk at the very beginning here, at the very outset, about what the question before us really is. The question before us is not whether it's a good idea for churches or other houses of worship or any other nonprofit organization to endorse or oppose candidates. The majority of people, as Mr. Seidel mentioned, oppose that idea. And I would say for most organizations, for most churches, for most houses of worship, it's probably a bad idea to do that. Because politics tend to be a divisive topic. And if a church or a minister in the context of a worship service were to choose to do that. In many churches, at least, it could alienate a significant portion of the congregation. And since we're here to talk about politics in the pulpit, I'm going to focus my comments mainly around the context of churches and houses of worship. But most of what we're going to talk about would still be equally relevant and applicable to other types of not-for-profit organizations. My esteemed co-panelist began his commentary, and even in his introduction, the remarks were made about keeping the wall of separation between church and state high and impregnable. And one of the issues here with respect to what we're calling the Johnson Amendment, which is this provision in the law that as it stands and as the IRS has interpreted it, means that churches, houses of worship, other 501c3 nonprofit organizations are prohibited from endorsing or opposing candidates, period, to any extent, in any way. So the issue is not so much about whether endorsing or opposing a candidate is a good idea. It's about what should be the law of the land and what are the implications of that law. If I were to ask you a different question, if I were to ask you, for example, do you think it would be okay, or do you think it is okay for the IRS to have the authority to monitor the content of a minister's sermons in a worship service and evaluate those sermons to determine whether they're too political or not too political for the purpose of determining whether the church should be taxed or not taxed, or should have its exempt status revoked? I would think we might want to think about that a little more carefully. I mean, the idea of IRS agents monitoring what is happening in worship services with the full authority of the federal government behind them, that seems problematic from a First Amendment perspective. So if we want to talk about a wall of separation between church and state being high and impregnable, then I think we would want to talk about a scenario where the IRS is not meddling in the affairs of what happens in a worship service or what a minister says in the context of a worship service. I had the privilege of chairing a national commission. Danny mentioned it earlier, the Commission on Accountability and Policy for Religious Organizations. And we addressed this very specific question, this specific topic, at the request of Senator Charles Grassley, who at the time was the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. Just so happens he's now the chair of the Senate Finance Committee. And we actually worked on this topic for about a year. And we brought together dozens of leaders from across the United States. We brought in leaders from literally every major faith group in America. We brought in a panel of legal experts that included constitutional law attorneys, attorneys who have argued cases before the U.S. Supreme Court. We brought in leaders from the non-religious nonprofit sector. And we had all of these folks weigh in on the issues. The problem is not so much that the Johnson Amendment in and of itself needs to be repealed. In fact, I don't favor, and neither did the commission favor, repeal of the Johnson Amendment. I think if you actually repealed it in its entirety, it would lead to some inappropriate behavior, some of which would be very much like what Mr. Seidel suggested. It would permit, for example, if you repealed the Johnson Amendment entirely, it would permit tax-deductible contributions to be made to churches, and then churches could turn around and make political campaign contributions to candidates. We don't think that would be a good idea. Now, there are other areas of law that would come to bear, like federal election law and potentially state and local campaign finance law that would bear on that as well. But neither I nor most of the folks that we've interacted with, nor the commission favors complete repeal of the Johnson Amendment. Instead, what the commission recommended was a fix to the Johnson Amendment, a repair, if you will, to the Johnson Amendment. And not just because we think there's this great demand on behalf of churches and other 501c3 organizations to make endorsements of candidates, but rather there's some problems with enforcement of the law as it is interpreted by the IRS. And let me give you a couple of examples, some really very real examples. So Mr. Seidel mentioned earlier that it's permissible under the current law to speak about issues. So for example, if you want to talk about in the context of a church or a 501c3 organization, if you want to talk about issues related to building a wall or issues related to immigration or issues related to the Supreme Court, you can do that, and that does not run afoul of the Johnson Amendment per se. But the IRS has said in its official guidance that if you talk about issues during an election season and you do it at a time that is approaching an election and you address issues that can be identified with particular candidates, you may be violating the Johnson Amendment. Well, now that's a problem because nobody knows exactly where those lines are. Literally, nobody knows where those lines are. And so if you have a minister delivering a sermon who does want to talk about the issues in October of 2020, is that okay or is it not okay? Particularly if the issues happen to be tied to one or more candidates. And the correct answer to that question is nobody knows. And that's a problem. So the idea is we need clarity and we need a law that can be enforced uniformly and fairly. And I will just wrap up, at least for now, by saying that the fix that the commission recommended and that I still believe is the best solution that I've seen is the idea of permitting a church or house of worship to basically communicate whatever it may want to communicate in the context of its regular worship services or its regular and customary exempt activities, so long as making those communications does not involve any incremental expenditures of charitable contribution money. So the idea is,
and I need you to wrap. I need you to wrap in here just a couple seconds, okay?
The idea is that we support the idea of not using charitable contributions, tax deductible charitable contributions, to support political communications. And I think that solution would allow it and keep the important parts of the Johnson Amendment intact.
Thank you, Mike. Two great opening statements by both of you. Thank you for that. A lot to think about. Andrew, give us a response to what you've heard.
We're doing 5-minute rebuttals now, yes?
5 minute, yeah. And I would call it a response, but it can be a rebuttal as well.
Okay, let me start my timer. Okay, well, I'm glad that my opponent seems to mostly agree with me. That's always thrilling to hear when you're having a discussion like this. I do want to talk a little bit about that commission because I want everybody needs to know that the commission was not part of the government. It was an arm of an evangelical group, the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability, largely made up of white men, right? 21 of the 24 people on your legal panel that was supposedly so diverse were white men. 4 of the 4 legal counsel for the commission were white men. There were no people of color on the 18-person nonprofit sector. And then your diverse religious sector panel, there were 8 non-Christians on that. And 6 of the 8 non-Christians signed on to a position paper disagreeing with the hybrid approach that you just mentioned. And at least one of the other 2 has actually publicly defended the Johnson Amendment. And I think it's also interesting to look at some of the funders of the commission too, the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, the Christian Broadcasting Network, Joyce Meyer Ministries, Samaritan's Purse. And then those were some of your biggest funders. And then not big, but I think pretty telling was that creationist hotbed in Kentucky, Ken Ham's Answers in Genesis, also contributed. But the 6 dissenters of the non-Christians on your religious panel included Rabbi David Saperstein, who is a lawyer and was the United States ambassador at large for international religious freedom. And those 6 disagreed with that incremental sort of hybrid approach that you mentioned, and they did it in writing. And they said, quote, "We wish to affirm strongly the ban on political endorsements by churches and other nonprofits and by clergy in their professional capacities. Anything that would allow political endorsements emanating from the pulpit and or in regular communications of a church poses grave risks to America's religious communities." And they were specifically against this hybrid incremental approach because all the line drawing problems that Mike mentioned are still going to exist. It's not going to clean up the lack of clarity in IRS regulations, but merely shift the confusion to a new set of rules with no history of interpretation whatsoever. And that is going to lead churches into trouble with the IRS and the Federal Election Commission and result in costly litigation. And again, that's from what they're saying. And another problem with this incrementalist approach, right, is that people are mostly arguing that this rule is unconstitutional burden on free speech and religious freedom. But then turning around and saying, well, we don't have to repeal it all the way, which is, it's an odd position to take because the same logic that underlies the argument for lifting the ban on just endorsing candidates from the pulpit, free exercise of religion, freedom of speech, would also apply to lifting the existing restrictions on lobbying, as well as the ban on candidates electioneering in congregation. Again, if they have a First Amendment right to endorse, then why not this First Amendment right to go whole hog? And if that's right, it's opening a worse than Citizens United churches as super PACs door. That's what you're seeing. And I mean, there's another flip side to this sort of hybrid approach too, is that repealing that is eventually going to lead to the regulation of churches. The more that is repealed, for all that fear mongering about IRS officials listening in on sermons, we know that doesn't really happen. It's when sermons are reported to the IRS, sometimes voluntarily, that's when you're going to see it. And it would be inviting more government regulation of churches. And I want everybody to know, I know we'll probably get some questions about enforcement too. There's an argument out there too that because the rule is not enforced, we should go ahead and change it. But that's not an argument against the Johnson Amendment. It's an argument for enforcement. And the rule does work. It works right now. Speed limits work on our highway, not as much on the Florida Turnpike, which I have driven many times, but speed limits work even when there are no speed traps out there. Speed limit signs also work. They work for people in the car. They work for the drivers. Drivers can tell passengers who say, hurry up, that they can't. Just like a church or a nonprofit can tell two donors on either side of the political divide that are trying to force it into politics, no, I'm sorry, we've got this limit on us. And this is one of the reasons that churches and nonprofits love this rule. It insulates them and prevents them from being forced into these divisive political debates. So again, let's just go ahead and keep the Johnson Amendment exactly as it is. It is working well, and it is a very popular rule.
Sorry about that. I was muted. Thank you, Andrew. Mike, 5 minutes.
Thank you. It's true that a small number of participants in the commission's work, a handful, dissented to the work of the roughly 67 participants in the commission's work who had a very, very high level of agreement with the recommendation. The issue with the Johnson Amendment, quite candidly, is one of administration. My esteemed co-panelist refers to it as being fear-mongering as to why the IRS isn't involved in monitoring the content of worship services. The IRS isn't involved in monitoring the content of worship services, and it's not involved in enforcing the Johnson Amendment today with respect to churches and worship services because it knows that would be a really bad idea. When the commission did its work, I had the privilege of also calling a meeting of pastors from predominantly Black churches to talk about this very issue. When we were doing the work in the commission, we learned from Pew Research that approximately half of predominantly Black churches in America during campaign seasons had sermons with content that specifically favored a particular political candidate, approximately half. So we convened a meeting of Black pastors in Washington to talk about that very issue. And we learned a lot from that. I learned a lot from that. One of the things that I learned about that, which I don't think I'll ever forget these conversations, was an explanation from the Black pastors as to why endorsing candidates and speaking to political campaigns is steeped in the culture of the Black church. And what they explained to me was that the Black church from days prior to abolition was seen as, and still is today, seen as the safe haven for discussing all issues related to the community, including political issues. One pastor specifically said, I have endorsed candidates. I do endorse candidates. I will endorse candidates. And if you have anything approximating half of the predominantly Black churches in America, and there are some other churches that were part of a movement by the Alliance Defending Freedom called Pulpit Freedom Sunday, where hundreds of churches deliberately engaged in sermoneering that involved political candidates and sent transcripts of their sermons to the IRS with a request to be audited. And the IRS never took the bait, never went after them because they know it would be a problem. Why would it be a problem? They don't want to litigate this issue. And I would submit, with all due respect, that the folks who argue for keeping the Johnson Amendment the way it is might want to be a little bit careful, because if it ever is litigated, the outcome of that litigation could be worse than what we're all hoping for, and it could open the door to activity that could be really problematic. I'll just wrap with this one comment. Mr. Seidel mentioned the Branch Ministries case, which was not a U.S. Supreme Court case involving church activity. Perhaps a more important case was the Regan versus Taxation with Representation case, which was a U.S. Supreme Court case in which the court said no organization can be denied the rights of free speech. It can, the law can govern what you do with tax deductible money, but no organization can be denied free speech. And I think that's an important thing to remember.
Thank you, Mike. And I want to say to both of you guys, hold on a second, let me stop my clock here. Say to both of you how enlightening both of your comments are. We could just keep volleying back and forth, and we may have time at the end. Andrew, I can't see you fully clear right now, but I can only imagine you're chomping at the bit to respond. But I'm going to ask you.
I took a few notes, but let's.
Okay.
I'd love to hear questions.
Yeah.
Mike, I don't know how you feel about this too, but like, I don't need to do a closing statement. We could just do Q&A for the rest of the time, and I'd be happy with that.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
It's fascinating to me, the nuances between your different perspectives, and that's really how I would describe it. It's and although I don't know that you all would describe it that way, but as an uninformed or less informed citizen listening to it, neither one of you are purporting that the whole idea is churches need to be involved in politics. I think the question becomes, what is the best way for the government to ensure that churches are not involved in politics, that's not, or at least tax-exempt churches are not involved in politics. And the solutions for that may be different. But let me go with a couple questions. And I have some of my own that are, I'll say, but let's start with others first in no particular order. This one is to Mike. How would you propose we clarify the Johnson Amendment, other than giving churches and clergy carte blanche to say anything?
Well, I think the idea is not spending tax-deductible contribution money on political campaign communications or political campaign activities. With the new standard deduction that we have for individual taxpayers, now at more than $24,000 for a married couple, it's estimated that 90% of American individual taxpayers get no tax benefit associated with their charitable giving anyway. So we're really only talking about, pick a number, 10%, 15%, 20%, pick whatever number you like, of charitable contributions that are actually getting a tax benefit. And we're talking about a rule change that would allow churches to communicate without making any incremental expenditures. So I think that's the nature of the fix that the commission recommended and that I support, lacking a better one. I haven't seen a better one yet.
Oh, I got a better one.
Okay. I was going to ask, Andrew, I was actually going to say, do you not see any way to improve the amendment other than the way it is today?
Yeah, no, I mean, the better road is to leave the Johnson Amendment as it is. I think that's absolutely true. Again, and this was members of the commission that Mike ran, that commented on this. Drawing that line just asks new questions that have to be answered, and it doesn't actually solve or give a lot of the clarity that you're looking for. And then you now have this precedent for saying, like, we're adjusting this probably because of free speech, free exercise rights. And once you do that, it's gone. And it's really important for people to understand too the structure. Again, this is not about free speech or free exercise. This is about tax exemption. Churches, like newspapers, which have double First Amendment protections, they enjoy First Amendment rights, but they have no constitutional immunity from taxes. And the Supreme Court has said that multiple times, 1936, 1943, 1970. I mean, there's no constitutional immunity from taxes. Tax exemption is a privilege, not a right. And this is a very reasonable string that has been attached to the privilege.
I'd like to respond to that, if I might. One of the issues, though, with taking the position that the Johnson Amendment should be left as is, and presumably I would assume that my co-panelist would support the idea of enforcing the Johnson Amendment. One of the problems with that is that would probably mean revoking the tax exemption of roughly half of the African American churches in America. I would see that as a problem, and I don't think that's actually a feasible solution, which is why the commission looked carefully at other solutions that are actually workable. And the problem with allowing churches to intentionally defy the law without any kind of enforcement, and then telling everybody else that they have to follow the law, creates a scenario where no one has any respect for the law and nobody knows where the lines are. And that's the real situation that we have today. And I believe that needs a fix.
Well, again, the argument that the rule is not enforced is not an argument against the law. It is an argument for enforcement of it. You mentioned Pulpit Freedom Sunday. The group that, by the way, is in charge of that, ADF, is a hate group. They advocate for Christian nationalism, the criminalization of homosexuality. They work to weaponize religious freedom and turn that hallowed protection into a license to discriminate. So again, it's the small white conservative fringe that is working to overturn this rule. And it does still work even without there being as much enforcement as, yes, I or my organization would like to see. And as far as the black churches go, the next Pew study cut those numbers in half, the numbers that you mentioned that regarding the 2016 election, those numbers plummeted. And the rule applies equally to everyone. The activism of black churches, I think, shows how much can be done even with the rule in place. It shows that the rule is not that burden on free exercise or free speech. In a way, I think it's proving my point. And to the extent that I hope this isn't what we're trying to say, that African American or black churches are incapable of complying with the rule, right? I think they absolutely are. The rule applies equally to all. That is the law. So to me, this seems less of an argument than an emotional appeal to mask the fact that getting rid of and totally destroying the Johnson Amendment, as Trump continually put it, is the dream of this small group of white conservative, usually evangelical Christians on the fringe. America itself is good with the rule.
So a question for both of you. I think you've alluded to it, and it may be just enforcement, but what other problems are there other problems that the law has created?
Yes. I doubt that Andrew would suggest there are any problems with the law. He loves it.
I would say no. Yeah.
But yes, there's some serious other problems with the law. Chief among them is the IRS's official, and I'm not talking about, this is not just my idea, You can look at IRS publication 1828. You can look at other IRS official guidance. There's a specific revenue procedure on the topic. The IRS says that when an organization or its officials, in the context of an official event of the organization, communicates about issues that can be identified with candidates, and they do that at a time frame that is in proximity of an election, that can be a violation of the Johnson Amendment. And literally nobody knows where those lines are. And so not only does the Johnson Amendment actually prohibit endorsement or opposition to candidates, it does effectively chill free speech related to issues. And a lot of times pastors and worship leaders steer widely clear of that in fear of that prohibition. And that's another chill on the First Amendment that is really inappropriate. So a fix would actually solve that problem as well.
Okay.
I mean, I'm not convinced that there's much stifling of true religious or free speech here at all. I mean the rule is, yes, rules are not always clear. I'm a lawyer. That's why I have a job. That's the vagaries of language are why I get paid. That's why there are so many lawyers in this country. I mean, that's just the reality of the law. I don't think that. I do think there's a lot of misconception here. If you violate the Johnson Amendment as a church, the likelihood that you're going to lose your tax exemption is almost nil. And that's not because the law is not enforced. It's because the IRS isn't going to come down on you that hard right away. You have to try to lose your tax exempt status. And oftentimes it wouldn't be something permanent. It would be a slap on the wrist at first. Or maybe it would be you lose your tax exempt status for 6 months if you've been really bad. I mean, it's a rule that people like, and the punishments for violating it are not so heavy that they chill free speech. They allow churches and nonprofits to say to their donors, these are things that we can't engage in. That is why the rules are so popular. You know, if you have a donor that says, I need you to endorse candidate A right now, they're your biggest donor, there's a lot of pressure on you to do that. And then your second and third biggest donors, donors B and C, come and say, I need you to endorse this other candidate, the guy on the other side of the aisle. Right now, you are stuck in this position of what do I do? I'm going to lose a donor either way. But you've got a rule that you can point to and say, look, I can't do that. I'm not allowed to. That's why the rule is so popular.
Yeah, we've heard that argument. That argument is we need the rule to protect us from ourselves.
I mean, that's one of the reasons churches love it. That's one of the reasons nonprofits love it.
But there's a great solution there, and that is adopt a provision in your own governing documents that prohibits that activity. And then you just say to the donor, hey, our governing documents prohibit that activity. We don't have to make it a law for everybody.
Okay, so Andrew, somebody's asked this question of you. Assuming Biden wins the election, what action should we take or he take to strengthen the Johnson Amendment? Which I'm not sure well, I'm just asking the question the way it's written. So how would you respond?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think the Johnson Amendment is fine as is. It's a very popular rule. I would like to see some sort of enforcement. The reason that there's not enforcement right now is not because of it's political. It had the enforcement of the Johnson Amendment was deliberately hamstrung by the people who support this rule change and couldn't get it changed. That was sort of the first part of this. And as Mike mentioned, there's groups out there, Alliance Defending Freedom, these hate groups that are deliberately trying to challenge it. They want that First Amendment challenge. They want to get it they want that challenge in the federal court system because they think the very conservative courts now are going to be just as hostile to the rule as they are. And I don't necessarily think that's wrong. Again, I don't think that's that would accurately reflect the constitutionality of the rule. I think that would more reflect realpolitik, whether or not it would survive a challenge in a hostile federal judiciary right now.
Right.
Yeah, I'd like to respond to that. I think there's another reason that the law is not enforced, and that is because the IRS knows how that would play out. You can imagine what the argument before the court would be. Your Honor, we're here to argue that this minister during a worship service uttered comments regarding political candidates, and we're here to revoke the tax exemption of this church. That's not going to play out very well. And we all know it wouldn't play out very well, which is why the IRS won't touch it, even though some organizations have not only done that in their worship services, but sent transcripts to the IRS requesting to be audited so that they could litigate it, and the IRS won't touch it. There's a reason they won't touch it.
They couldn't touch it for a long time. I mean, the way the audit process was set up, they couldn't touch it. It was not possible. They also didn't have people in that position at that level, according to the rules. So,
and one of my concerns is that your organization creates pressure for the IRS to enforce the law. And one of my concerns, candidly, is that there will be a tipping point where this issue does get litigated, and I have a feeling the outcome would probably be the exact opposite of what you would hope. And it would probably repeal more of the law than I would hope, and actually create a bad scenario. So that's literally one of my concerns, is that if that dog keeps chasing that car, he might catch it one day and it might not be what he thought it was.
Hey, so let me, at the risk of making it too personal, let me talk about some of the issue as it relates to me. I am a white evangelical pastor, right in Andrew's crosshairs, but we're friendly. So, but I recently saw a message that a Christian pastor of another faith, but Christian, another church, current, probably spoken within the last month, based on what I saw. I don't know exact date, but he was speaking. I'm trying to say this in as plain a language as possible without tipping my hand as to who it was, but you might be able to draw your own conclusion. That'd be fine. He was calling out someone who is a practicer of his same faith, somebody who purports to be somebody in his same faith, and he was calling him out by name for being a poor representation of that faith that he is a pastor of. And so he is saying, this person is purporting to be one of us, and I'm telling you, based on his politics, he's not a very good one of us if he is one of us. It begged the question to me, wow, where does that stand in relation to, is that something that is outside what the Johnson Amendment says, or does it provide for that? Is that well within the structure of what's permissible within the Johnson Amendment? I'd hear from you first, Andrew.
I just want to be clear on so it's one pastor saying that another pastor is not a good.
Sorry, no. It's a pastor saying one of the two candidates for president.
Oh, I see.
Who purports to be a part of his faith tradition is not representing that faith tradition appropriately.
Yeah, and then are they drawing a conclusion on who to vote for, things like that?
I don't know that he said.
I'll go ahead and answer with what I have. So I mean, the way the IRS looks at like the totality of what is going on. They don't just jump in unless it's clear, unless you're saying don't vote for X, vote for Y. The IRS is going to look at the totality of the circumstances and determine whether or not the person was trying to endorse or oppose a candidate for office. I mean, it sounds like that is something that is definitely at least coming up to the line. And I can tell you that FFRF, the organization I work for, we've reported, for instance, a few Catholic churches, and I believe, I don't know if it was an archbishop. Anyway, one in Colorado, one here in Wisconsin, who were making it very, very clear, commenting on, for instance, the national conventions of the various parties, and making it very, very clear, drawing that line between being a good member or bad member of their religion and voting for somebody, which cross lines. So it definitely can. Without knowing the specific facts of that, I won't say more than that, though.
Well,
Mike?
there was a very public instance of that exact thing happening, not in this campaign, but a prior one where the same exact thing happened, where a church spoke out against one of the candidates and claimed that he was not a good Catholic and shouldn't take communion. And the IRS actually began to put their toe in the water on that one, but then decided pretty quickly that that was a bad idea. And they backed off of that. In 2016, a prominent religious leader was asked about Mr. Trump, and this religious leader said, "A person who thinks only about building walls, wherever they may be, and not building bridges is not Christian." That religious leader who said that happened to be Pope Francis. And so, when we talk about should churches make statements about candidates, or should religious leaders, we've got some big company that are engaged in some of these conversations. And I think the idea of trying to enforce the law and haul them into court and revoke their exemptions would be a pretty daunting task.
Well, I mean, and again, Pope Francis is the head of his own state, so not exactly a great analogy there. And I think people need to maybe understand a little bit more about the enforcement here, since you're really hammering that. Right? The enforcement of this is secret. We don't know what happens. The IRS engages with the church when they are enforcing this law. The only way we would ever find out about it is if the church really resisted and it eventually went to a court case, and then that court case was a published opinion, which is rare. So we don't also know a lot of what's happening, because this does involve the internal finances and governments of organizations. So when the IRS enforces this, whether against churches or nonprofits, that's not something that is public, that we get to open the book on and see what's happening.
One last quick comment about all of that. You mentioned at the beginning correctly, of course, that this became law in 1954. It was proposed by then Senator Lyndon Johnson, hence the name Johnson Amendment. But amazingly, our country from 1776 until 1954 got along just fine without the Johnson Amendment. It's amazing how for literally more than 100 years, we were able to operate just fine. But since it's been adopted, we have these controversies. So I would question whether it's really been helpful.
Well, I have to answer that. I mean, first of all, church and state were one for nearly all of history. So, saying that, maybe the state didn't tax the church, or excuse me, the state didn't tax the state is not very probative, right? Church property wasn't government property for a long time. But it's also not true to say that religion being involved in our politics caused no problems or everything was just fine. Never mind that the founders wrote about the torrents of blood that were spilled throughout human history as a result of this. But, even the history of our own country right here, religion forcing itself into the political arena caused massive problems and some of the worst bloodshed that our country has seen. I mean, I wrote about in The Founding Myth, my book, how to a larger extent than people are willing to discuss, the Civil War was a religious war. And I based that part of the book on the work of excellent scholars like David Goldfield, who wrote America Aflame. I mean, to say that there have been no problems is far too shallow and uncritical a reading of history to base a new policy on. And it's also important to note that the federal income tax doesn't date anywhere near back that far. Remember, we're talking about tax exemptions. That's what we're talking about here. The first federal income tax was right after the Civil War to fund recovery, and that kind of quickly expired. But before that, the government was funded with tariffs and excise taxes, not income taxes on individuals and businesses. We didn't have a federal income tax that survived court challenge until I think it was 1909 when the 16th Amendment was passed. the first mention of a tax-exempt group was the Tariff Act of 1894. And it wasn't really until the Revenue Act of 1913 that any income tax system with tax exemptions for certain organizations was established. So that 1913 to 1954 history is actually much shorter than what you're talking about from 1776. So if history is going to be our deciding factor, let's look at that. And even if we stretched it back to the 1894 Act, the Johnson Amendment's still been around longer, 60 versus 66 years. And again, it wasn't until 1943 that the Form 990 reporting was established, and the modern tax code, including the various 501c designations, such as 501c3 tax exempt, 501c4, you got to pay a little bit, right? That was the Revenue Act of 1954 that established the modern code, which includes the Johnson Amendment. So, and this is probably all very confusing to people, and that is totally understandable, but the history is complicated, and it's not as nearly as clear as Mike just made it out to be.
So to both of you, why is, somebody's asked this will be our last question, and then I'm going to wrap it, but why is this always, or seem to land in the church arena and not in all nonprofits? Why is it seem to be Christian religion issue and not all charities?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a reason that the founders put at the very top of the Bill of Rights two very important freedoms: the freedom of speech and the free exercise of religion. Those are two of our most cherished rights in the United States of America. The ability of a minister to say what he or she believes is appropriate in the context of a worship service encompasses both of those freedoms together. The government has no business weighing into what happens inside of a worship service. And I think that's the bottom line. Hey, if a church or a house of worship doesn't want to endorse a candidate, don't do it. But the government doesn't need to be there to wave a hammer over your head telling you what they're going to do to you if you happen to want to talk about political issues or the issues of the day.
Andrew?
Not a hammer, just a tax exemption. And the first freedom in the First Amendment is our right to a secular government, and that's partially because there's no such thing as the freedom of religion without a government that is free from religion. But to answer the actual question, there's two reasons why we're kind of narrowing down on churches here. One, because that's the topic of this debate. It was politics in the pulpit. That was the discussion. So that sort of framed it for both Mike and I think. And the second reason, which I think is a little more important, is that it is this small fringe of white evangelical conservative churches that are pushing to repeal the Johnson Amendment. And that's it. Nobody else wants it. It's just this very, very small vocal fringe that is pushing for it. So that's why the discussion often comes back to churches.
Yeah, I would, you may be right on that. As a pastor and the way conversation works, I would answer the question, most charities don't have a crowd that they speak to every 7 days, and we do. Yeah. And that is very enticing to anybody trying to sway public opinion. So the pressure is going to be for churches and pastors to speak to the issues, because that's where you can move people in one direction or another, versus a charity who they're not as commonly gathering and influencing people every 7 days like churches are. So it seems to me that's why the issue is becoming more pronounced with churches, as opposed to, I don't see enforcement issues with other charities and stuff like I see in churches, regardless of why it is in the church, because we have an audience gathered every 7 days. Is there any logic to that, Andrew?
I mean, I think it's an interesting point for sure. I think it probably was significantly more persuasive before, for instance, the advent of social media. And I mean, for instance, the Freedom from Religion Foundation, I think has, I don't know, like maybe 500,000 on Facebook. I don't know. I don't do that much on it, but I mean, and it's very easy to post something. Again, I do it all the time on my personal stuff, vote for so-and-so. And that would be a huge influential reach. I mean, you're talking about being able to do it week after week after week, which I think is interesting, but the repetitive nature of it, I think, is probably not as poignant nowadays as sort of the
Okay.
broad reach that somebody can have. But it is
Yeah.
an interesting point for sure.
Okay, everybody, this has been fantastic. I want to issue my really profound appreciation to Andrew and to Mike for joining us today. This has been very informative. I want to encourage you and let you guys know we've had zero drop off in the participants since we started. People were very interested in everything that you had to say. And thank you for enlightening us and helping us to better understand the issue from differing perspectives. It's been very, very enlightening for us. And again, I want to say to everybody, we're a local commission. We'd love to have your participation. You can see early in the chat where we listed the link where you can sign up to get more information from us in the future. I'd want to give a nod to David Williamson, who has his camera off, but he's been our co-host for our time together and really the brains behind all of the technical side and really helping me be as prepared as I could be for what we did today. So thank you, David Williamson, for your part in our event today. And
Danny, thank you so much for hosting, and Mike, thanks for doing this. It's really great to have a nice collegial conversation like this, especially these days. So thank you.
Agreed, and thank you all very much.
Well, Andrew and Mike, that's part of our aim here at our little friendly commission, is to create these kind of conversations so that all of us better understand the issues in a respectful, friendly way. We don't have to agree on everything, but we can come away richer and more educated and have a better understanding as a result of it. And it's what we want to model for everybody who's a part of the event with us today. And thank you both for demonstrating that in your comments and in your demeanor.